The fluorescent lights in room 2123 of the Rayburn House Office Building cast everything in harsh, unforgiving clarity. I sat at the witness table, my hands folded carefully over the manila folder that contained 5 years of evidence, and watched Congressman Bradley shuffle through his notes one final time. Behind me, the gallery was packed with reporters, environmental advocates, and suits I recognized from the energy sector. The weight of their attention pressed against my shoulders like a physical thing. But it wasn't the cameras or the congressional committee that made my stomach clench. It was the text message that had buzzed on my phone just as I was being sworn in. From David Mitchell, CEO of Meridian Energy Solutions, the company I'd given 12 years of my life to, the man I'd once respected enough to work 18-hour days for. Hope you remember where your loyalties lie, Sarah. Some bridges can't be rebuilt. I'd turned my phone face down after reading it, but the message echoed in my mind as Congressman Bradley cleared his throat and leaned into his microphone. This wasn't just about environmental compliance anymore. This was about a choice I'd made 3 months ago when I first walked into Jennifer Chen's law office in DuPont Circle with a flash drive full of falsified reports. This was about the moment I decided that my conscience was worth more than my career. What I didn't know, sitting in that witness chair on March 15, 2024, was that while I was exposing Meridian's lies to Congress, they were already destroying my life 600 miles away in Houston. While I was sworn to tell the truth, they were crafting one final lie about me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Michelle Torres, and until 6 months ago, I believed that doing the right thing would be enough to protect me. I was 38 years old, a senior environmental compliance director at Meridian Energy Solutions, and the single mother of 2 kids who depended on me for everything from their health insurance to their college dreams. I'd built my career on precision, documentation, and an unwavering belief that environmental protection wasn't just regulation, it was moral obligation. That morning in the Rayburn building, as I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces waiting for my testimony, I should have felt vindicated. After all, I was here because truth had finally found its voice. But instead, I felt the peculiar sensation of being completely alone in a room full of people who supposedly shared my values. The journey to that witness table had started 5 years earlier, in 2019, when I first noticed discrepancies in the soil contamination reports for the Clearwater Solar Initiative in Nevada. It was a massive federal project, part of the Department of Energy's push toward renewable infrastructure, and Meridian had landed the environmental compliance contract worth $42 million. The preliminary soil samples should have shown elevated mercury levels near the proposed installation site. I'd been to the location myself, had seen the old mining equipment scattered across the landscape, the telltale discoloration in the earth. But the reports that crossed my desk showed clean readings. Not just acceptable levels, but pristine soil composition that would have made the site suitable for organic farming. I remember staring at those numbers, cross-referencing them with the geological surveys I'd personally reviewed, and feeling that familiar twist in my stomach that came when something didn't align. I'd approached Tyler Harrison about it during one of our quarterly compliance meetings. Tyler was 29 then, fresh from his MBA program at Rice University, and 6 months into his role as Director of Environmental Affairs. He'd gotten the position despite having 0 field experience, a fact that hadn't surprised anyone who knew his uncle James Harrison sat on Meridian's board of directors. Tyler had that particular brand of confidence that comes from never having been truly challenged, and when I raised my concerns about the Clearwater reports, he dismissed them with a wave of his hand. Sarah, I appreciate your attention to detail, but these reports have been triple-checked by our lab partners. Sometimes field conditions can be misleading. We have to trust the scientific process. But I knew the scientific process, and I knew when it was being manipulated. Over the next 18 months, I quietly began documenting every report that crossed my desk, creating my own database of inconsistencies. The patterns were unmistakable. Projects in environmentally sensitive areas consistently showed cleaner than expected results. Wildlife impact assessments minimized endangered species populations. Water table analysis ignored obvious contamination sources. By 2021, I had evidence of systematic falsification across 14 federal projects worth a combined $3 billion. But I also had 2 teenagers depending on my income, a mortgage in Arlington that consumed 40% of my salary, and a mother in San Antonio whose diabetes medication cost more than most people's car payments. Meridian's health insurance was excellent, and my position provided the stability my family needed. Speaking up meant risking everything I'd built over 12 years. The decision was made for me in January 2024, when I discovered the Riverbend Wind Farm assessments. The project was slated for construction in protected wetlands in Louisiana, habitat for the Louisiana black bear, a species only recently removed from the endangered list. The environmental impact reports showed minimal wildlife presence and described the wetlands as seasonally dry grassland. But I'd been to Riverbend myself just 3 months earlier for a preliminary site survey. I'd photographed bear tracks in the mud, documented nesting sites for 3 protected bird species, and collected water samples that clearly indicated year-round saturation. The lies weren't just about profit anymore. They were about destroying ecosystems that would take decades to recover. That night, I sat at my kitchen table in Arlington, my laptop open to the Riverbend files, while Emma worked on her AP biology homework beside me and Jake practiced violin in the living room. The ordinary domesticity of the moment, the smell of leftover pizza, the soft scratch of Emma's pencil, Jake's tentative scales, made the magnitude of what I was considering feel both more real and more terrifying. Emma looked up from her textbook, catching me staring at the screen with what must have been obvious distress. "Mom, you okay? You look like you're solving world hunger or something." I managed a smile. "Just work stuff, sweetheart. How's the genetics unit going?" "Complicated," she said, then grinned. "But I like complicated." My daughter had inherited my analytical mind and my stubborn streak, traits that served her well in her accelerated STEM program but would make the conversation I'd eventually have to have with her that much harder. How do you explain to a 14-year-old that sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything they depend on? But that night, watching Emma puzzle through dominant and recessive alleles, I realized I couldn't build her future on a foundation of environmental destruction. The projects I was certifying would still be poisoning watersheds when she had children of her own. I closed my laptop and made the decision that would eventually lead me to that witness table in Congress. The next morning, I called Jennifer Chen's office. Jennifer was a whistleblower attorney who specialized in environmental cases, and her reputation for protecting sources was legendary in Washington legal circles. We'd met 2 years earlier at an environmental law conference, and she'd given me her card with the kind of meaningful look that suggested she suspected what was happening at Meridian. Our first meeting was in a coffee shop near Union Station, deliberately public and casual. Jennifer was 42, precise in her movements and questions, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made me understand why corporate executives feared her. She listened to my preliminary concerns without taking notes, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she understood both the technical and legal implications of what I was describing. "What you're talking about," she said finally, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate calm, "is conspiracy to defraud the federal government, multiple felonies, the kind of case that destroys companies and sends executives to prison." "I know," I said. "That's why I've been documenting everything." She studied my face carefully. "Sarah, I want to be clear about what this process looks like. If we proceed, you'll be protected under federal whistleblower statutes, but that protection isn't immediate, and it isn't complete. Meridian will fight back, and they'll fight dirty. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Emma's college applications, about Jake's asthma medications, about my mother's insulin. I thought about the Louisiana black bears whose habitat was about to be destroyed based on lies I'd helped legitimize through my silence. "Yes," I said. "I'm prepared." Over the next 6 weeks, Jennifer and I built an airtight case. She connected me with Dr. Patricia Kim, a former EPA colleague who now worked as a staffer for the House Subcommittee on Environment and Climate Change. Patricia had been tracking irregularities in federal environmental contracts for months, and my evidence provided the missing pieces she needed to recommend a congressional hearing. The process of copying and organizing 5 years of files was surreal. I worked late nights in my home office, scanning documents and creating encrypted backups while my children slept upstairs. Every falsified report, every manipulated photograph, every email chain where executives discussed managing environmental findings, it all went into a digital archive that would eventually bring down one of the largest energy consulting firms in the country. But Meridian wasn't sitting idle. In February, I noticed subtle changes in my work environment. Meetings were scheduled without me. Email chains I'd normally be included on stopped reaching my inbox. Tyler Harrison began reviewing my reports with unusual scrutiny, questioning methodology I'd used successfully for years. The most unsettling change was David Mitchell's sudden personal interest in my work. David was Meridian's CEO, a 52-year-old former oil executive who'd built the company's reputation on aggressive federal contract bidding. He'd spoken to me perhaps a dozen times in 12 years, usually in passing at company events. But in the weeks leading up to my congressional testimony, he began stopping by my office with increasing frequency. "Sarah, I wanted to check in personally," he'd said during one particularly memorable visit. "I know the federal compliance landscape is getting more complex. If you're feeling overwhelmed, we can always bring in additional support." His tone was paternal, concerned, but his eyes held a calculation that made my skin crawl. He knew. Somehow, despite all my precautions, he knew I was talking to Congress. The realization that I was being watched added a layer of paranoia to an already stressful situation. I began varying my routes to work, using different coffee shops for meetings with Jennifer, and communicating with Patricia Kim only through encrypted messaging apps. The cloak and dagger routine felt ridiculous. I was an environmental scientist, not a spy. But Jennifer assured me that corporate retaliation against whistleblowers often included surveillance and intimidation. The tension at home was becoming harder to hide. Emma had noticed my distraction and began asking pointed questions about why I was working so many late nights. Jake, more sensitive to emotional undercurrents, became clingy and anxious, needing extra reassurance at bedtime. I found myself caught between the need to protect them from worry and the impossibility of explaining why our entire lives might be about to change. The breaking point came 3 days before my scheduled testimony. I arrived at work to find Tyler Harrison and Rebecca Walsh, Meridian's VP of Legal Affairs, waiting in my office. Rebecca was 45, Harvard Law, and known throughout the company for her ruthless efficiency in handling, quote, personnel issues. Her presence in my office was about as subtle as a fire alarm. "Sarah, we need to discuss some concerns about your recent work quality," Rebecca began, her voice professionally neutral but her posture aggressive. She was holding a folder that I recognized as containing my reports from the past 6 months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tyler shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with whatever was about to happen, but lacking the spine to object. "We've noticed some inconsistencies in your analytical approach," he added. "Questions about your objectivity in certain assessments." I felt my training kick in, the same analytical calm that served me well in environmental fieldwork. "What specific inconsistencies are you referring to?" Rebecca opened the folder and spread several reports across my desk. Each one had been marked with red ink, highlighting sections where I'd noted potential environmental concerns that had later been overruled by Tyler's department. These recommendations show a pattern of excessive caution that's inconsistent with accepted industry standards. There's also concern about your recent communication with external parties regarding company projects. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. They knew about Jennifer, about Patricia, possibly about the entire congressional investigation. But they were being careful, dancing around direct accusations, because they knew I was about to testify under federal protection. "I stand by every assessment I've made," I said evenly. "My recommendations are based on established scientific methodology and federal compliance requirements." Rebecca smiled, the expression sharp and predatory. "Of course! We're simply suggesting that your perspective may have become clouded by external influences. We'd like to recommend you take some time to reconsider your priorities." The threat was clear, but so was their limitation. They couldn't fire me outright without triggering federal whistleblower protections, but they could make my life miserable until I chose to leave voluntarily. It was a strategy I'd seen them use on other employees who'd become inconvenient. I appreciate your concern, I replied, but my priorities are very clear. I'll continue to perform my duties according to federal compliance standards. Tyler looked relieved that the confrontation was ending without escalation, but Rebecca's expression suggested this was only the opening move in a longer game. As they left my office, I realized that the next 72 hours would determine not just my career but potentially my entire future. That evening, I called my mother in San Antonio. Elena Torres had been a high school teacher for 35 years before retirement, and she possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from dealing with difficult people in impossible situations. I'd always turn to her when facing major decisions, and despite the risk of worrying her, I needed her perspective now. Mija, she said after I'd explained the situation in carefully vague terms, you've always known the difference between right and wrong. That's not something I taught you. That's something you were born with. Don't let them take that away from you now. Her words carried me through the flight to Washington, through the sleepless night at the Hampton Inn on Capitol Hill, and into the witness chair where I now sat, facing a panel of representatives who held the power to either validate my sacrifice or render it meaningless. Congressman Bradley's voice cut through my reflections as he called the hearing to order. The committee will now hear testimony regarding alleged environmental compliance violations in federal energy contracts. Our first witness is Ms. Sarah Michelle Torres, Senior Environmental Compliance Director at Meridian Energy Solutions. I leaned forward to the microphone, my prepared statement in front of me, and began to speak the words that would irrevocably change everything. What I didn't know was that 600 miles away in Houston, David Mitchell was already implementing his final solution to the Sarah Torres problem. The truth, as I was about to learn, has a way of protecting itself. But it doesn't always protect the people who speak it. The morning I testified to Congress, I truly believed that speaking the truth would be my shield. I had spent weeks preparing with Jennifer Chen, rehearsing answers to potential questions, organizing my evidence into clear, irrefutable timelines. What I hadn't prepared for was the feeling of absolute isolation that comes when you realize that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee protection from the consequences. My testimony lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. I know the exact duration because Jennifer had warned me to pace myself, to drink water between responses, to maintain eye contact with the committee members who seemed most engaged. Congressman Bradley asked detailed questions about the Clearwater Solar Initiative, pressing me to explain how soil contamination data could be systematically altered without triggering quality control protocols. Representative Martinez focused on the financial implications, wanting to understand how environmental fraud translated into profit margins for companies like Meridian. The most challenging questions came from Representative Johnson, a former environmental engineer who understood the technical aspects of what I was describing. She walked me through the Riverbend wind farm case step by step, asking me to explain exactly how wildlife population assessments could be manipulated to minimize protected species counts. Her questions were precise, informed, and devastating to Meridian's credibility. Ms. Torres, she said during a particularly intense exchange, in your professional opinion, could these discrepancies between field observations and reported data be attributed to incompetence or oversight? I had known this question would come, had rehearsed my answer dozens of times, but sitting in that witness chair with cameras rolling, and knowing that David Mitchell was probably watching from Houston, the weight of my response felt enormous. Representative Johnson, based on my 12 years of experience in environmental compliance and my review of internal communications, these discrepancies represent systematic, intentional falsification designed to minimize environmental impact findings and expedite project approvals. This was not incompetence. This was fraud. The word hung in the air like a bell that couldn't be unrung. Around me, I could hear the scratch of pens on notepads, the quiet click of laptop keys, as reporters documented what would become the soundbite that defined the hearing. I had just accused one of the largest energy consulting firms in the country of committing multiple felonies, and I had done it under oath, on the record, with federal protection that I prayed would prove more substantial than the paper it was written on. During the lunch recess, I checked my phone for the first time since the morning. 17 missed calls from Maria Gonzalez. my closest colleague at Meridian and the only person in Houston who knew where I was. Maria had been my anchor in the company for 8 years, the kind of friend who remembered your children's birthdays and covered for you when you needed to leave early for parent-teacher conferences. Her repeated calls sent ice through my veins. I found a quiet corridor near the committee rooms and called her back. She answered on the first ring, her voice strained and careful. "Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all morning. You need to know what's happening here." The background noise suggested she was calling from outside the building, possibly from her car. Maria was naturally cautious, but she sounded genuinely frightened. "What's going on?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be worse than I'd anticipated. "David called an emergency leadership meeting this morning. Rebecca Walsh was there, Tyler, the whole executive team. They announced that you'd been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into potential misconduct and breach of confidentiality." My stomach dropped. Administrative leave was corporate speak for career death, a way to remove someone from their position while building a legal case for termination. It also meant my access to Meridian systems would be revoked, my company credit cards canceled, and my health insurance suspended within hours. "What kind of misconduct?" I asked, though I was already picturing Emma's horrified face when I explained that her health insurance might not cover her upcoming orthodontist appointment. "They're saying you've been sharing proprietary information with external parties without authorization, violating confidentiality agreements." Rebecca specifically mentioned, quote, "corporate espionage and industrial sabotage." Maria's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sarah, they're trying to destroy you. They've already boxed up your office." The hallway suddenly felt too small, too warm. I leaned against the wall, processing the implications of what Maria was telling me. Meridian wasn't just retaliating against my testimony, they were attempting to discredit me entirely, to transform me from a whistleblower protected by federal law into a corporate spy who could be prosecuted under trade secret statutes. "Did they say anything about criminal charges?" Rebecca mentioned that they were, quote, "exploring all legal options," and that they had serious concerns about potential theft of intellectual property. Sarah, she looked pleased when she said it, like she'd been planning this for weeks. Of course she had been planning it. The confrontation in my office 3 days earlier, Tyler's increased scrutiny of my work, David's sudden personal interest in my projects. It had all been preparation for this moment. They had known about my congressional testimony, had known they couldn't prevent it, so they had prepared to destroy my credibility the moment I spoke. "Maria, I need you to be very careful about being seen talking to me. If they're building a case around corporate espionage, they'll investigate anyone who's been in contact with me." "I don't care," she said fiercely. "What they're doing is wrong, and everyone knows it. Half the environmental team is talking about looking for new jobs. People are scared, but they're also angry." Her loyalty meant everything to me in that moment, but it also terrified me. Maria had 2 young children and a husband who'd been laid off 6 months earlier. She couldn't afford to lose her job defending me, no matter how principled her instincts. "Promise me you'll be careful," I said. "Document everything they say about this investigation, but don't take any risks that could put your family in jeopardy." After we hung up, I sat in that empty hallway for 10 minutes, staring at my phone and trying to process the speed with which my life was unraveling. That morning, I had been a senior environmental compliance director with 12 years of unblemished service and a reputation for integrity. By lunch, I was unemployed, under investigation for corporate espionage, and facing the possibility of criminal charges that could send me to prison. The afternoon session of my testimony continued for another 2 hours, but I found it difficult to focus entirely on the questions. Part of my mind was calculating how long my savings would last, whether Emma's acceptance to the summer STEM program at Georgetown would have to be canceled, whether I could afford to keep Jake in his violin lessons. The practical implications of unemployment were crowding out my ability to concentrate on environmental fraud, which felt like exactly what Meridian had intended. Representative Martinez seemed to sense my distraction during the final hour. "Ms. Torres, are you facing any retaliation from your employer as a result of your decision to testify here today?" The question was my opportunity to explain what had happened, to put Meridian's actions on the congressional record, but Jennifer had warned me to be cautious about discussing ongoing personnel matters during my testimony. Premature disclosure could complicate legal protections and give Meridian ammunition for their corporate espionage narrative. Representative Martinez, I am aware that my testimony here today may have professional consequences. However, I believe that federal environmental laws exist to protect public health and safety, and that my obligation to uphold those laws supersedes any personal or professional considerations. It was a diplomatic answer, but it felt inadequate given the magnitude of what Meridian was attempting to do to me. I wanted to tell the committee that while I was testifying about environmental fraud, the company I was exposing was systematically destroying my life 600 miles away. I wanted to explain that corporate retaliation against whistleblowers wasn't just about losing a job. It was about losing health insurance for children with medical conditions, losing the financial stability that allowed me to care for my aging mother, losing the professional reputation I had spent 12 years building. But I said none of that. I answered their questions about soil contamination and wildlife assessments, provided technical explanations for how environmental data could be falsified, and submitted my evidence to the congressional record. When Chairman Bradley gavelled the session to a close at 4:37, I felt simultaneously vindicated and terrified. The flight back to Arlington that evening was surreal. I sat in seat 14C of a half-empty Southwest flight, laptop closed, staring out the window at the lights scattered across Virginia as we approached Reagan National. For 3 hours, I had been the center of national attention, speaking truth to power in the most literal sense possible. Now I was just another unemployed single mother flying home to explain to her children why their lives were about to change dramatically. Emma and Jake were staying with Mrs. Patterson, our neighbor, who had been watching them since I'd left for Washington 3 days earlier. Mrs. Patterson was 72, a retired librarian who had become a surrogate grandmother to my children after we'd moved to Arlington. She knew I was testifying to Congress about environmental issues, but I hadn't explained the personal risks involved, or the possibility that I might return home without a job. When I knocked on her door at 8:15, both children rushed to hug me with the kind of enthusiasm that made my heart ache. They were excited to hear about my important meeting in Washington, as I had described it to them, and Jake immediately launched into a detailed account of everything that had happened while I was gone. Emma, more perceptive, studied my face carefully and asked if everything was okay. "We need to have a family meeting when we get home," I told them, which immediately triggered Jake's anxiety and Emma's analytical mind. "Are we moving again?" Jake asked. We had moved twice in his 11 years, once when his father and I divorced and once when I'd taken the position at Meridian. To him, family meetings meant upheaval. "No, sweetheart. We're not moving, but there are some changes happening with my job that we need to talk about." Emma's expression shifted to the serious, adult-like concern that sometimes made me forget she was only 14. "Are you in trouble?" The question was more perceptive than she could have known. Was I in trouble? I was unemployed, under investigation for corporate espionage, and facing potential criminal charges for protecting environmental regulations. My family's health insurance would be suspended within days, my professional reputation was under attack, and I had just made powerful enemies who were committed to destroying my ability to work in my chosen field. "It's complicated," I said, which was both true and utterly inadequate. Back in our house, sitting around the kitchen table where we'd made countless family decisions over the years, I tried to explain the situation in terms my children could understand without terrifying them. I told them that I had discovered wrongdoing at my company, that I had reported it to the government as required by law, and that the company was angry about my decision to tell the truth. "So you did the right thing, but they're punishing you for it?" Emma asked, her voice carrying the kind of moral outrage that reminded me why I had testified in the first place. "Yes," I said simply. "Sometimes that's what happens when you speak up about something important." Jake, practical in the way that 11-year-olds can be, immediately focused on the implications. "Does this mean I can't take violin lessons anymore?" The question hit me harder than any congressional inquiry had. Jake had started violin 2 years earlier and had shown genuine talent and passion for music. His lessons cost $120 a month, which had never felt significant when I was earning a senior director's salary. Now, unemployed and facing potential legal bills, $120 might as well have been $1,000. "We might need to take a break from lessons," I said carefully. "But this is temporary. I'm going to find another job, and things will get back to normal." Emma leaned forward, her expression intense. Mom, what if they try to hurt you? Like legally? Can companies do that when people report them for breaking the law? Her question revealed that she understood more about the situation than I had realized, and it forced me to confront the possibility that Meridian's retaliation might extend beyond employment consequences. Corporate espionage charges could result in federal prosecution, substantial fines, and prison time. If they were successful in portraying me as a corporate spy rather than a whistleblower, I could lose not just my career but my freedom. There are laws that are supposed to protect people who report wrongdoing, I said. I have a good lawyer, and I believe that truth and documentation will protect us. But even as I said it, I wondered if I was trying to convince them or myself. Jennifer Chen was excellent, but she was one attorney facing a corporation with unlimited legal resources, and a demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their interests. Federal whistleblower protections existed on paper, but enforcement was inconsistent and often came too late to prevent the financial and professional destruction of the people who needed protection. That night, after the children were in bed, I sat at my laptop in the kitchen and began the grim task of assessing our financial situation. My last paycheck from Meridian would cover April's mortgage and utilities, but after that we would be dependent on my savings and whatever unemployment benefits I could qualify for. Emma's summer STEM program cost $3,000. Jake's violin lessons added up to $1,400 a year, and my mother's diabetes medication cost $800 a month when she couldn't afford her Medicare supplemental insurance. I pulled up Indeed and began searching for environmental compliance positions in the Washington area. But even as I scrolled through job listings, I knew that Meridian's corporate espionage narrative would follow me to any potential employer. Background checks would reveal the investigation, and HR departments would be reluctant to hire someone facing potential criminal charges, regardless of the circumstances. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. For 12 years, my professional identity had been built around collaboration, around being part of teams working toward environmental protection and regulatory compliance. Now I was radioactive, a liability that other environmental professionals would need to avoid to protect their own careers. The community I had devoted my professional life to building was no longer safe for me to inhabit. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The message was brief but chilling. "Enjoyed your performance today. Hope it was worth it." I stared at the message for several minutes, debating whether to report it to Jennifer or to the Congressional Committee's security staff. Anonymous threats were a common form of retaliation against whistleblowers, but they were also difficult to trace and rarely resulted in criminal charges. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that Meridian's strategy wasn't primarily about intimidation. It was about systematic professional destruction, conducted through legal channels that would be difficult to challenge and impossible to reverse quickly. I turned off my phone and went upstairs to check on my children, a ritual that had comforted me through every difficult period of single parenthood. Emma was asleep with a biology textbook still open beside her, unconsciously dedicated to her studies, even in sleep. Jake had arranged his stuffed animals in precise formation around his pillow, a habit that revealed his need for order and control in an increasingly chaotic world. Looking at them sleeping peacefully, trusting that I would continue to provide the stability and security they needed, I felt the full weight of what I had risked by testifying to Congress. Their futures depended on my ability to rebuild a career that Meridian was systematically destroying. Their health and education depended on my capacity to navigate a legal and professional landscape that had suddenly turned hostile. But I also felt something else, something quieter but more resilient than fear. I felt the certainty that comes from knowing you've acted according to your deepest principles, even when those principles demand sacrifice. I had spoken truth to power, had protected environmental regulations that existed to safeguard public health, had chosen moral courage over personal security. The next morning would bring phone calls from potential employers who had seen the news coverage of my testimony, emails from environmental organizations offering support, and a message from Mark Rodriguez, the former Meridian engineer who had left the company 6 months earlier under circumstances that were beginning to make more sense. The network of people who understood what Meridian was doing to me was larger than I had realized, and their support would prove more valuable than I could have imagined. But that night, sitting in my kitchen in Arlington with my career in ruins and my family's future uncertain, All I could do was trust that speaking the truth had been worth the consequences, even if those consequences were more severe than I had ever anticipated. The war with Meridian Energy Solutions was just beginning, and I was learning that corporate retaliation was a sophisticated, multifaceted strategy designed not just to punish whistleblowers, but to deter anyone else from following their example. What I didn't yet understand was that my documentation, my relationships, and my unwavering commitment to environmental protection would eventually become weapons more powerful than anything Meridian could deploy against me. The truth, as I was about to discover, has a remarkable capacity for self-preservation. And sometimes, when you're willing to sacrifice everything to protect it, the truth finds ways to protect you in return. The phone call that changed everything came at 7:43 on a Thursday morning, exactly 9 days after my testimony. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, watching the news coverage of congressional budget hearings, and wondering if my environmental fraud story had already been forgotten by the media cycle, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Usually I would have let it go to voicemail, but something about the timing felt significant. The voice on the other end was careful, professional, with the slight accent that suggested English wasn't the speaker's first language. "Ms. Torres? This is Dr. Chen Wei from the Government Accountability Office. I apologize for calling so early, but I believe we have some mutual concerns regarding Meridian Energy Solutions. The GAO. I knew the name but had never interacted with them directly. The Government Accountability Office was Congress's investigative arm, the agency responsible for auditing federal programs and investigating fraud allegations. If they were calling me, it meant my testimony had triggered something much larger than a congressional hearing. Dr. Chen, I'm listening. I would prefer not to discuss this matter over the phone. Would it be possible for you to meet with me today? I can come to the Washington area, or if you prefer, we could meet at our offices." The urgency in his voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. This wasn't a routine follow-up interview. Something had happened that required immediate attention, and somehow it involved me. "I can be in Washington by noon," I said, already mentally rearranging my day of job searching and phone calls with Jennifer Chen about Meridian's escalating legal threats. "Excellent. I'll send you an address. Ms. Torres, I should mention that you may want to bring your attorney to this meeting." After he hung up, I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath my feet. In 9 days, I had gone from environmental compliance director to unemployed whistleblower to potential criminal defendant in Meridian's corporate espionage narrative. Now the GAO was calling emergency meetings and suggesting I bring legal representation. The scope of whatever was happening was expanding beyond anything I had anticipated. I called Jennifer immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. Jennifer had been fielding calls from reporters and managing Meridian's increasingly aggressive legal threats since my testimony, and I had begun to sense that she was dealing with more information than she had shared with me. "Sarah, good timing. I was going to call you this morning anyway. We need to talk. The GAO just called. They want to meet today, and they suggested I bring you." There was a pause that lasted long enough for me to hear traffic noise in the background. Jennifer was already in her car, already heading somewhere important. "That fits with what I learned yesterday. Sarah, there are things happening that you need to know about. Things that go beyond just Meridian's retaliation against you." 20 minutes later, I was driving toward Washington with more questions than answers, trying to reconcile the careful world of environmental compliance I had known for 12 years with the increasingly complex legal and political landscape I was now navigating. The GAO building was located on G Street, an imposing structure that radiated federal authority and bureaucratic seriousness. Jennifer met me in the lobby, her expression grim but determined. "Before we go upstairs," she said, "you need to understand that your testimony appears to have uncovered something much larger than environmental fraud at one company. The information you provided has triggered a multi-agency investigation, and there are implications that reach beyond Meridian." We took the elevator to the 14th floor in silence, but I could feel Jennifer's tension. She was an experienced whistleblower attorney who had handled dozens of federal fraud cases, but something about this situation was different. When we reached Dr. Chen's office, I began to understand why. Dr. Chen Wei was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of precise manner that suggested a background in forensic accounting or criminal investigation. But he wasn't alone. Seated around the conference table were representatives from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, the Department of Energy's Office of Inspector General, and someone from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit, who introduced herself as Special Agent Lisa Morrison. "Ms. Torres," Dr. Chen began, "thank you for coming on such short notice. I want to begin by assuring you that you are here as a cooperating witness, not as a subject of any investigation. Your testimony to Congress has provided crucial evidence for a multi-agency investigation that has been ongoing for 18 months. 18 months. They had been investigating environmental fraud in federal energy contracts for a year and a half before my testimony, which meant my evidence wasn't the beginning of their case against Meridian. It was the missing piece that allowed them to move forward with criminal charges." Special Agent Morrison leaned forward, her expression serious but not unfriendly. "Ms. Torres, we understand that Meridian Energy Solutions has initiated a corporate espionage investigation against you in response to your congressional testimony. We want you to know that we consider this action to be potential witness intimidation, and we are prepared to take appropriate steps to protect your rights as a federal witness." The relief I felt at hearing those words was overwhelming. For 9 days, I had felt isolated and defenseless against Meridian's legal machinery, wondering if my federal whistleblower protections would prove meaningful in practice. Now I was sitting in a room full of federal investigators who viewed Meridian's retaliation as potential criminal conduct. "What kind of investigation has been ongoing for 18 months?" I asked. Dr. Chen opened a folder and spread several documents across the table. I recognized some of them immediately. Environmental compliance reports from federal energy projects dating back to 2019. But there were others I had never seen. Reports from different companies on different projects, all showing similar patterns of environmental data manipulation. Meridian Energy Solutions is not the only consulting firm that has been falsifying environmental compliance data for federal energy projects, he explained. We have identified at least 4 companies involved in what appears to be a coordinated scheme to minimize environmental findings in order to expedite project approvals and maximize profits. Agent Morrison added, "The total value of potentially fraudulent federal contracts exceeds $8 billion. This is not just about environmental compliance violations. This is about conspiracy to defraud the federal government on a massive scale." I stared at the documents spread across the table, feeling simultaneously vindicated and horrified. My 5 years of evidence from Meridian was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a systematic corruption of federal environmental oversight that had been operating across multiple companies and dozens of projects. "How long have you known about Meridian specifically?" Jennifer asked. "We've suspected irregularities in their compliance reports for over a year," the EPA representative replied. "But we lacked the internal documentation necessary to prove systematic fraud." Ms. Torres's testimony provided that documentation, along with expert testimony about how the fraud was accomplished. Dr. Chen turned to me with an expression that suggested he understood the personal cost of my decision to testify. "Ms. Torres, we need you to know that your cooperation with this investigation will likely require ongoing involvement over several months. There will be additional testimony, document review, and possibly trial testimony if the case proceeds to criminal prosecution. We understand that this represents a significant commitment, particularly given your current employment situation." The employment situation. A delicate way of referring to the fact that I was unemployed, under investigation for corporate espionage, and facing potential criminal charges that could send me to prison for activities that federal investigators now considered crucial cooperation with a major fraud investigation. "What about the corporate espionage allegations?" I asked. "Meridian is claiming that I stole proprietary information and shared it with unauthorized parties." Agent Morrison's expression hardened. "We've reviewed Meridian's allegations, and we consider them to be retaliatory and without merit. The information you provided to Congress and to this investigation consists of evidence of criminal activity, not proprietary business information. Meridian cannot claim trade secret protection over documents that evidence federal crimes." Jennifer leaned forward. "What kind of protection can you provide against continued retaliation?" We're prepared to file federal charges against any Meridian executives who engage in witness intimidation or obstruction of justice, Agent Morrison replied. We're also coordinating with the Department of Labor's Office of Inspector General to ensure that Ms. Torres's whistleblower protections are enforced. The meeting continued for another hour, during which I learned that my evidence had already led to search warrants being executed at Meridian's Houston headquarters and the offices of 3 other energy consulting firms. The investigation involved not just environmental fraud, but potential money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of prison time for senior executives. When we finally left the GAO building, I felt like I was walking in a different world than the one I had entered. For 9 days, I had been struggling with the personal consequences of speaking truth to power, wondering if my sacrifice had been worth the cost to my family's security. Now I understood that my testimony had triggered the largest environmental fraud investigation in federal history, with implications that reached far beyond my personal situation. Jennifer and I found a quiet coffee shop near DuPont Circle, the same neighborhood where we had first met to discuss my evidence against Meridian. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were back where it all started, but now the stakes were exponentially higher. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, Jennifer said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the same deliberate precision I remembered from our first meeting. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because this investigation is going to get much more intense, and Meridian's retaliation is likely to escalate before it gets better. I thought about Emma, who had started researching environmental law schools after learning about my testimony. I thought about Jake, who had told his violin teacher that his mother was, quote, fighting bad guys who hurt the environment. I thought about my mother in San Antonio, who called every morning to check on us and who had offered to refinance her house to help with our expenses. Jennifer, 3 weeks ago, I was worried about quarterly compliance reports and whether Jake needed new violin strings. Now I am a key witness in the largest environmental fraud investigation in federal history. I don't think I can be more prepared for what comes next than I already am. She smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since my testimony. Good. Because I have some other news that might interest you. She pulled out her phone and showed me an email that had arrived that morning. The sender was Dr. Margaret Foster, director of the Environmental Enforcement Institute, a Washington-based organization that specialized in supporting environmental whistleblowers and investigating corporate environmental crimes. They want to offer you a position, Jennifer said, Senior Environmental Forensics Consultant. The salary isn't quite what you were making at Meridian, but it comes with legal support, federal witness protection coordination, and the opportunity to work on cases like yours across multiple industries. I read the email twice, hardly believing what I was seeing. 3 weeks ago, I had thought my career in environmental compliance was over, that Meridian's corporate espionage allegations would make me unemployable in my field. Now I was being offered a position that would allow me to continue the work I had started as a whistleblower, with federal protection and institutional support. There's more, Jennifer continued. The Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Inspector General has asked if you would be interested in serving as a consultant on their new Environmental Compliance Oversight Initiative. They're creating a program specifically designed to detect and investigate the kind of fraud you uncovered at Meridian. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that I found myself laughing out loud in the middle of a coffee shop. 9 days ago, I had been an unemployed single mother, facing potential criminal charges for protecting environmental regulations. Now federal agencies were competing to hire me for positions that would allow me to continue that protection on a national scale. What about Meridian's corporate espionage investigation? I asked. Dead in the water, Jennifer replied. Once federal prosecutors make it clear that you're a protected witness in a major criminal investigation, Meridian's legal team will back off immediately. They can't afford to be seen as obstructing a federal investigation, especially one that's already resulted in search warrants and will likely result in criminal indictments. That evening, I called Maria Gonzalez for the first time since my testimony. She answered immediately, her voice filled with relief and excitement. Sarah, thank God you called. You need to know what's happening here. I think I have some idea, I said. Federal agents executed search warrants at the Houston office today. It was incredible, Maria said, her voice barely containing her excitement. They showed up at 8 this morning with a team of forensic accountants and computer specialists. They spent 6 hours going through the environmental compliance department, copying hard drives and boxing up documents. David Mitchell looked like he was going to have a heart attack. What about Tyler and Rebecca? Tyler's been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. Rebecca is still here, but she's been in meetings with outside counsel all day. Word is that several executives have already hired criminal defense attorneys. The speed with which Meridian's power structure was collapsing was breathtaking. 3 weeks ago, these were the people who had controlled my career, who had made decisions about my family's health insurance and financial security. Now they were the subjects of a federal criminal investigation that could send them to prison for decades. Maria, what's the mood in the environmental department? People are scared but also relieved, she said. Everyone knew something was wrong with the compliance reports, but no one wanted to risk their jobs by speaking up. Now that the truth is coming out, people are talking about things they've been keeping quiet for years. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and called Emma and Jake into the room. They had been following the news coverage of the Meridian investigation with the intense interest that teenagers and preteens bring to stories that directly affect their lives. Emma had been researching environmental law on her own, and Jake had been telling anyone who would listen that his mother was helping the government catch criminals. I have some good news, I told them. I've been offered a new job, working with the government to investigate environmental crimes like the ones I discovered at Meridian. Emma's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. So you're going to keep doing what you did, but for the good guys this time? Something like that, I said, laughing at her characterization of federal law enforcement as the good guys. Jake's question was more practical. Does this mean I can take violin lessons again? Yes, sweetheart, it means we're going to be okay. But even as I said it, I knew that the real test was still ahead. Meridian Energy Solutions was a powerful corporation with unlimited legal resources and a demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their interests. The federal investigation was just beginning, and my role as a key witness would make me a target for continued retaliation. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly Meridian's carefully constructed narrative would begin to unravel, or how the very documentation and relationships I had built over 12 years would become the foundation for their complete destruction. The investigation was about to reveal not just environmental fraud, but a web of corruption that reached into multiple federal agencies and involved dozens of energy consulting firms across the country. The war between truth and corporate power was escalating, but for the first time since my congressional testimony, I felt like I was fighting from a position of strength rather than defending from a position of vulnerability. Federal law enforcement was on my side, my expertise was valued rather than threatened, and my decision to speak up was being validated by investigators who understood the magnitude of what I had uncovered. The next phase of the investigation would test that strength in ways I couldn't yet imagine, but sitting in my kitchen in Arlington with my children excited about the future rather than worried about our security, I felt ready for whatever Meridian tried to do next. The truth, as I was beginning to understand, had its own momentum once it was set in motion, and that momentum was now working in my favor rather than against me. 6 months into the federal investigation, I stood in my new office at the Environmental Enforcement Institute, watching CNN coverage of David Mitchell being led away from Meridian's Houston headquarters in handcuffs. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Energy CEO arrested in $8 billion federal fraud scheme," while the reporter explained that Mitchell was facing 47 federal charges, including conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering. The transformation had been gradual, then sudden. My position as senior environmental forensics consultant had evolved into something much more significant. As the investigation expanded, I was no longer just a witness to Meridian's crimes. I had become the federal government's leading expert on environmental compliance fraud across the energy consulting industry. My office walls were covered with organizational charts mapping corruption networks that spanned dozens of companies and hundreds of federal contracts. Dr. Patricia Kim knocked on my office door, holding a stack of documents that I recognized as the final grand jury indictments. Patricia had become more than a congressional staffer. She was now coordinating environmental oversight across multiple House committees. And our professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship built on shared commitment to environmental protection. Sarah, I wanted you to see these before they're unsealed tomorrow, she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. 43 defendants across 7 companies. RICO charges for the executives. This is the largest environmental fraud prosecution in federal history. I flipped through the indictments, recognizing names from my 12 years at Meridian alongside executives from companies I had never heard of. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving systematic falsification of environmental data across renewable energy projects in 17 states. The financial impact extended beyond the $8 billion in fraudulent contracts to include cleanup costs for environmental damage that could reach into the tens of billions. What about Tyler Harrison? I asked, scanning the list for Meridian's former director of environmental affairs. Cooperating witness, Patricia replied. His testimony about the systematic nature of the fraud, particularly his communications with executives at other companies, has been crucial for establishing the RICO conspiracy. Tyler's cooperation shouldn't have surprised me. He had always been more follower than leader, more ambitious than principled. When faced with decades in federal prison, he had made the pragmatic choice to testify against the executives who had used him to implement their fraud scheme. His uncle James Harrison, the board member who had secured Tyler's position at Meridian, was among those indicted for racketeering. The irony of Tyler's situation wasn't lost on me. 6 months ago, he had been the beneficiary of nepotism, installed in a position he wasn't qualified for to help execute environmental fraud. Now he was a cooperating witness against the same family connections that had elevated him, trading his testimony for a reduced sentence and witness protection. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Chen. Decision coming down at 4 p.m. Press conference at 5. You ready for this? The decision she was referring to was the Justice Department's announcement about my role in the ongoing prosecution. For months, there had been discussions about whether my involvement should remain confidential or whether I should become a public face of the investigation. The decision had implications that extended far beyond my personal situation to the broader question of how the federal government protects and supports environmental whistleblowers. At 3:45, I walked across the street to the Justice Department building, where I had spent countless hours over the past months, providing testimony and helping federal prosecutors understand the technical aspects of environmental compliance fraud. The building had become familiar territory, but today felt different. Today, my role was shifting from protected witness to public advocate for environmental enforcement. Attorney General Rebecca Martinez was waiting in the conference room along with FBI Director James Patterson and EPA Administrator Dr. Susan Chen. The presence of 3 cabinet-level officials suggested that this announcement was intended to send a message that extended beyond the Meridian case to the broader issue of corporate environmental accountability. Ms. Torres, Attorney General Martinez began, I want to begin by thanking you for your extraordinary courage and cooperation with this investigation. Your decision to testify to Congress and to cooperate with federal law enforcement has resulted in the most significant environmental fraud prosecution in our nation's history. She paused, looking at notes that I suspected were more for ceremonial purposes than necessity. We're announcing today that you will be serving as Special Advisor for Environmental Compliance Enforcement, a new position created specifically to prevent the kind of systematic fraud you helped uncover. This position will coordinate environmental enforcement across multiple federal agencies and will have direct reporting authority to my office. The magnitude of what she was offering took several seconds to fully process. I was being asked to help create and lead a new federal program designed to detect and prosecute environmental fraud across all federal agencies. It was a position that would place me at the center of national environmental policy, with resources and authority that I had never imagined possible. EPA Administrator Chen leaned forward. Sarah, this position would also include oversight of a new environmental compliance monitoring system that would use advanced data analytics to detect the kind of irregularities you identified at Meridian. We're talking about real-time monitoring of every environmental compliance report submitted for federal projects. The technology they were describing would have prevented the fraud I had discovered at Meridian by automatically flagging discrepancies between field observations and reported data. It was the kind of systematic solution that could transform environmental enforcement from reactive investigation to proactive prevention. What about my family? I asked. This level of visibility would make us targets for retaliation from the companies and individuals we're investigating. FBI Director Patterson answered immediately. The Justice Department is prepared to provide comprehensive security for you and your family. This includes residential security, transportation security, and ongoing threat assessment. We consider your safety to be a matter of national security, given your role in environmental enforcement. The offer was overwhelming in its scope and implications. I would be leaving behind the relative anonymity of my consulting position to become a public figure in environmental enforcement, with federal security protection and direct access to cabinet-level officials. My expertise in environmental compliance would be elevated to national policy influence, and my decision to speak up about Meridian's fraud would be vindicated in the most complete way possible. But I also understood that accepting this position would make me a permanent target for corporate interests threatened by aggressive environmental enforcement. Energy companies, mining corporations, and chemical manufacturers would view me as an existential threat to their ability to minimize environmental compliance costs through fraud and manipulation. I need to discuss this with my children, I said. This decision affects their lives as much as mine. Attorney General Martinez nodded. Of course. Take whatever time you need. But I want you to know that this offer reflects our recognition that environmental enforcement requires people with your combination of technical expertise, moral courage, and practical experience with corporate retaliation. That evening, I drove home to Arlington, thinking about how completely my life had changed since the morning I had testified to Congress. 6 months ago, I had been an unemployed single mother facing potential criminal charges for protecting environmental regulations. Now I was being offered a position that would make me one of the most powerful environmental enforcement officials in the federal government. Emma and Jake were waiting for me in the kitchen, homework spread across the table alongside the dinner Maria had brought over. Maria Gonzalez had left Meridian 3 months earlier to join the Environmental Enforcement Institute as a senior analyst, and she had become an unofficial member of our family, helping with the children during my frequent trips to Washington and providing the kind of emotional support that made our new life possible. Mom, you look like you got good news and bad news at the same time, Emma observed, looking up from her calculus homework. At 15, she had developed an uncanny ability to read my emotional state, a skill that had been crucial during the most difficult months of the investigation. I got offered a promotion, I said. A big one, but it would mean some significant changes for our family. I explained the position in terms they could understand, emphasizing both the opportunity to influence environmental policy at the national level and the security implications of becoming a high-profile target for corporate retaliation. Emma's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic, while Jake's response was more cautious and practical. Would we have to move? Jake asked. At 12, he had adjusted well to our new circumstances, but stability remained important to him. No, we could stay in Arlington, but we would have security protection, and there would be restrictions on some of our activities. Emma leaned forward, her expression intense. Mom, this is what you've been working toward your entire career. You have the chance to prevent what happened at Meridian from happening anywhere else. How can you not take it? Her words reminded me of something my mother had said during one of our weekly phone calls, when I had expressed uncertainty about the direction my life was taking. Mija, you've always known the difference between right and wrong. Don't let fear keep you from doing what you know is right. The next morning, I called Attorney General Martinez and accepted the position. 3 weeks later, I was standing behind a podium in the Justice Department's main briefing room, facing cameras from every major news network, announcing the creation of the Environmental Compliance Enforcement Initiative and the indictments of 43 defendants in the largest environmental fraud case in federal history. The questions from reporters were aggressive and well-informed. They wanted to know about the scope of the conspiracy, the financial impact of the fraud, and the implications for future environmental enforcement. But the question that stayed with me came from a reporter for Environmental Law Review. Ms. Torres, what would you say to other environmental professionals who witness compliance violations but are afraid to speak up because of potential retaliation? I thought about Maria, still working at Meridian when I made my decision to testify. I thought about Mark Rodriguez, the engineer who had left Meridian months before my testimony, possibly because he had seen the same irregularities I had documented. I thought about all the environmental professionals across the country who knew about compliance violations but felt trapped by economic necessity and fear of corporate retaliation. I would tell them that the federal government is committed to protecting environmental whistleblowers and that speaking up about environmental fraud is not just a professional obligation, it's a moral imperative. The Environmental Compliance Enforcement Initiative exists specifically to support environmental professionals who have the courage to protect public health and environmental safety. After the press conference, I returned to my new office in the Justice Department building, where my assistant had placed a stack of case files on my desk. Each file represented a potential environmental fraud investigation triggered by whistleblower reports from across the country. Environmental professionals, who had seen the Meridian coverage, were coming forward with evidence of similar fraud at their companies. The scope of environmental compliance fraud was larger than any of us had imagined. My investigation of Meridian had uncovered just one network in a much broader pattern of systematic environmental regulatory capture. Energy companies, mining corporations, chemical manufacturers, and defense contractors were all involved in schemes to minimize environmental compliance costs through fraud, falsification, and regulatory manipulation. But the infrastructure was now in place to detect and prosecute this fraud systematically. The Environmental Compliance Monitoring System was operational, flagging irregularities in real time across all federal environmental compliance reports. The Justice Department had created a specialized environmental crimes unit, with prosecutors trained specifically in environmental fraud cases. And most importantly, environmental professionals across the country now knew that speaking up about compliance violations would be supported rather than punished. 6 months later, I stood in the same congressional hearing room where I had first testified about Meridian's fraud, but this time I was there as Special Advisor for Environmental Compliance Enforcement, presenting the first annual report on environmental fraud prevention. The statistics were encouraging. Environmental compliance fraud had decreased by 67% across federal projects, and voluntary reporting of environmental violations had increased by 300%. Congressman Bradley, who had chaired my original testimony, leaned into his microphone with a question that brought the transformation full circle. Ms. Torres, when you first testified to this committee about environmental fraud at Meridian Energy Solutions, did you anticipate that your testimony would lead to the creation of a new federal environmental enforcement program? I thought about that morning 6 months earlier, sitting in the witness chair with David Mitchell's threatening text message still fresh in my memory, believing that I was sacrificing my career to protect environmental regulations that most people didn't understand or care about. Congressman Bradley, I testified because I believed that environmental protection was more important than my personal security. I never imagined that my testimony would lead to systemic change in how the federal government approaches environmental enforcement. But I've learned that speaking truth to power, especially when that truth is supported by documentation and evidence, can have consequences that extend far beyond what any individual whistleblower anticipates. After the hearing, I walked out of the Rayburn building into the late afternoon sunshine, thinking about the environmental professionals across the country who were now protected by the systems we had created, the federal projects that were now subject to real-time compliance monitoring, and the corporate executives who would think twice before authorizing environmental fraud. Emma was waiting for me in the car, having driven over from her internship at the EPA's Office of Inspector General. At 16, she was already demonstrating the same analytical mind and environmental commitment that had shaped my career, but with opportunities and protections that hadn't existed when I started in environmental compliance. "How did it go?" she asked as I settled into the passenger seat. "Good," I said. "Really good. The system is working." As we drove home to Arlington, I reflected on the journey from that morning in the Meridian boardroom when I had first realized something was wrong, to this afternoon when I had reported to Congress on the success of environmental enforcement reforms. The personal cost had been enormous, the professional risk had been absolute, but the outcome had exceeded anything I had dared to hope for. Environmental fraud was being detected and prosecuted systematically across the federal government. Corporate executives were facing real consequences for environmental crimes. And environmental professionals across the country knew that speaking up about compliance violations would be supported by federal law enforcement rather than punished by corporate retaliation. The war between environmental protection and corporate profit would continue, but the balance of power had shifted fundamentally. Truth, when supported by documentation and federal enforcement, had proven more powerful than corporate intimidation and legal manipulation. And sometimes, when you're willing to sacrifice everything to protect environmental regulations, those regulations find ways to protect you in return. That evening, Jake performed his first violin recital since the investigation began, playing a piece he had been working on throughout the months of testimony and legal proceedings. As I listened to his music filling the auditorium, surrounded by Emma, Maria, Jennifer, and Patricia Kim, I understood that the most important victory wasn't the criminal convictions, or the policy changes, or even the federal position I now held. The most important victory was that my children had watched me choose principle over security, truth over convenience, environmental protection over personal safety, and they had seen that choice validated and supported by institutions committed to justice. They had learned that speaking up about wrongdoing, even when the personal cost is enormous, can lead to systematic change that protects other people from facing the same impossible choices. The investigation that had started with my testimony about environmental fraud at Meridian Energy Solutions had become something much larger and more significant, a demonstration that individual courage, when combined with institutional support and systematic enforcement, can transform entire industries and protect environmental regulations for future generations. The morning I received the call that would reshape everything I thought I understood about justice, I was sitting in my new office at the Environmental Enforcement Institute, reviewing case files from whistleblowers across 12 different states. Each file represented someone who had made the same impossible choice I had made 8 months earlier, choosing environmental protection over personal security, and each case was now being handled by federal investigators, with resources and authority that hadn't existed when I first walked into Jennifer Chen's office, with my flash drive full of evidence. Dr. Margaret Foster knocked on my door with an expression that I had learned to recognize as significant news barely contained. Margaret had been my supervisor and mentor since joining the Institute, but over the months she had become something more valuable, a strategic advisor who understood both the technical aspects of environmental enforcement and the political landscape that determined which cases received federal attention. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with Deputy Attorney General Williams. They want to expand your role significantly." She settled into the chair across from my desk, holding a folder that looked official enough to contain policy changes that would affect thousands of environmental professionals across the country. The weight of whatever was in that folder felt substantial, the kind of bureaucratic significance that translated into real-world impact for people trying to protect environmental regulations without destroying their careers. The Environmental Compliance Enforcement Initiative has been so successful that they're creating a permanent office within the Justice Department, and they want you to head it as Associate Deputy Attorney General for Environmental Crimes. The title alone was enough to make me pause my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Associate Deputy Attorney General wasn't just a promotion. It was elevation to the senior leadership of federal law enforcement, with authority that extended across all environmental crimes, investigations, and policy development for environmental enforcement. Margaret, that's a presidential appointment. Senate confirmation. Media scrutiny of everything I've ever done or said. "I know," she replied, her expression serious but encouraging. "They're prepared for all of that. More importantly, they believe that your experience as both an environmental professional and a whistleblower makes you uniquely qualified to lead environmental enforcement policy for the entire federal government." I stared out my office window toward the Capitol building, where 8 months earlier I had testified about environmental fraud at Meridian Energy Solutions, while receiving text messages that threatened my career and family security. The transformation from that terrified witness to a potential senior Justice Department official felt surreal, like someone else's career trajectory that I was observing from a distance. What would this mean for Emma and Jake? Margaret's expression softened. She had children of her own, and understood that career decisions at this level affected entire families, especially when those careers involved making powerful enemies in corporate boardrooms across multiple industries. Full federal security protection, including residential security and secure transportation. Educational opportunities through federal programs, including college scholarships and internship programs. And most importantly, the knowledge that their mother is leading national environmental protection policy. That afternoon, I drove home to Arlington, thinking about the conversation I would need to have with my children, the same conversation that had become a recurring theme over the past 8 months as my role in environmental enforcement had expanded beyond anything I had originally anticipated. Each new opportunity had required family discussion about security implications, lifestyle changes, and the ongoing consequences of having made powerful enemies in the energy consulting industry. Emma was waiting for me in the kitchen, her AP Environmental Science textbook open beside a laptop displaying what looked like college application essays. At 16, she had already decided to pursue environmental law, inspired by watching the investigation that had started with my testimony evolve into systematic reform of federal environmental enforcement. "Mom, you have that look again," she said, glancing up from her essay with the perceptive attention that reminded me of myself at her age. "Good opportunity or complicated opportunity?" "Both," I replied, settling into the chair beside her and noticing that her essay topic was titled, "Environmental Whistleblowing and Federal Policy Reform, a Case Study in Institutional Change." They want me to head the new Environmental Crimes Office at the Justice Department. It would mean Senate confirmation hearings, media attention, and a much higher profile role in environmental enforcement. Jake looked up from his violin practice in the living room, having developed the ability to monitor kitchen conversations while maintaining focus on his music. At 13, he had adapted to our new circumstances with remarkable resilience, but he still preferred advance notice of major changes that might affect his routine or social life. "Would we have to move to Washington?" he asked, his concern focused on the practical implications that mattered most to a 13-year-old who had finally settled into a new school and made friends who understood why federal agents occasionally picked him up from soccer practice. "No. We could stay in Arlington, but there would be more security protocols and more public attention." Emma closed her laptop and turned to face me with the kind of serious expression that indicated she had been thinking about these issues more deeply than I had realized. "Mom, do you remember what you told me when this all started? About how sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences that affect your whole family?" I nodded, remembering the conversation in our kitchen when I had first explained why I was testifying to Congress, trying to help her understand why our lives might become more complicated, because I had chosen to expose environmental fraud. "You said that you couldn't build my future on a foundation of environmental destruction, that the projects you were certifying would still be poisoning watersheds when I had children of my own." Her words carried the kind of moral clarity that reminded me why I had made that initial decision to contact Jennifer Chen, why I had chosen to testify despite the threats and retaliation, and why I had continued cooperating with federal investigators even when the personal cost felt overwhelming. "This position would let you prevent environmental fraud across the entire federal government," she continued. "You could create systems that protect environmental regulations for decades, not just individual cases. How is that different from the choice you made 8 months ago?" Jake set down his violin and joined us in the kitchen, his expression thoughtful in the way that suggested he had been listening to more of our conversation than I had realized. "Mom, the security stuff doesn't bother me anymore. I like knowing that people are watching out for us, and my friends think it's cool that my mom catches environmental criminals." Their responses reminded me that children adapt to circumstances more readily than adults, and that they had already processed the reality of living with federal security protection and public attention in ways that felt normal to them. They had watched me transform from an unemployed single mother facing corporate retaliation to a federal environmental enforcement official, and they understood that transformation as validation of principles rather than personal ambition. That evening, I called my mother in San Antonio to discuss the opportunity and its implications. Elena Torres had been my emotional anchor throughout the investigation, providing perspective and support during the most difficult months of corporate retaliation and federal testimony. Her response was immediate and characteristically direct. "Maida, you've spent 8 months helping the government understand how to catch environmental criminals. Now they want you to lead that effort for the entire country. This isn't about career advancement, this is about using your experience to protect environmental regulations for other people's children and grandchildren." Her words crystallized the decision in ways that career considerations and security implications couldn't. This wasn't about personal advancement or professional validation. It was about institutionalizing the lessons learned from the Meridian investigation to prevent other environmental professionals from facing the same impossible choices I had confronted. The next morning, I called Deputy Attorney General Williams and accepted the nomination. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a Senate hearing room, facing the Judiciary Committee for my confirmation hearing as Associate Deputy Attorney General for Environmental Crimes. The hearing room was packed with environmental advocates, energy industry representatives, and reporters who had been following environmental enforcement policy since my original testimony about Meridian. The questions were aggressive and well-prepared, reflecting the political significance of environmental enforcement in an era of climate change and energy transition. Senator Richardson, the committee chair, opened with questions about my qualifications and vision for environmental crimes prosecution. Ms. Torres, your experience as a whistleblower is certainly relevant to this position, but how does that experience translate to leading policy development for environmental enforcement across all federal agencies? I had spent weeks preparing for this question with Jennifer Chen and the Justice Department's confirmation team. But sitting in that witness chair facing cameras and skeptical senators, I found myself drawing on something deeper than prepared talking points. Senator Richardson, my experience as a whistleblower taught me that environmental professionals across the country are witnessing compliance violations every day, but they lack institutional support for reporting those violations without destroying their careers. The Environmental Crimes Office would create systematic protection for environmental professionals who have the courage to speak up about regulatory violations. Senator Martinez leaned forward with a question that cut to the heart of industry concerns about aggressive environmental enforcement. Ms. Torres, energy companies are arguing that increased environmental enforcement will delay critical infrastructure projects and increase energy costs for American consumers. How do you balance environmental protection with economic considerations? The question was a trap, designed to force me to choose between environmental protection and economic impact. But my experience with the Meridian investigation had taught me that this was a false choice based on corporate propaganda rather than economic reality. Senator Martinez, the Meridian case demonstrated that environmental fraud actually increases project costs and delays by requiring expensive cleanup and remediation when environmental problems are discovered later in the project lifecycle. Accurate environmental compliance from the beginning reduces costs and delays by identifying potential problems early when they can be addressed efficiently. The questioning continued for 3 hours, covering everything from my personal financial disclosures to detailed policy questions about environmental enforcement priorities. But the moment that defined the hearing came when Senator Williams asked about retaliation against environmental whistleblowers. Ms. Torres, what would you say to environmental professionals who are afraid to report compliance violations because they've seen what happened to people like you who speak up about environmental fraud? I thought about Maria Gonzalez, who had risked her career to support me during the Meridian investigation, and who was now working as a senior analyst at the Environmental Enforcement Institute. I thought about Mark Rodriguez, the engineer who had left Meridian months before my testimony, possibly because he had witnessed the same environmental fraud I had documented. I thought about the dozens of environmental professionals who had contacted the Environmental Crimes Unit over the past months, reporting compliance violations at their companies with the knowledge that federal law enforcement would protect rather than punish their courage. Senator Williams, I would tell them that the federal government is now committed to supporting environmental professionals who speak up about compliance violations, and that the Environmental Crimes Office exists specifically to ensure that protecting environmental regulations enhances rather than destroys their careers. The confirmation vote was scheduled for the following week, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Environmental protection had become a bipartisan issue, as the costs of environmental fraud had become clear through cases like Meridian. And my role in exposing that fraud had established credibility that transcended political considerations. On the morning the Senate voted to confirm my nomination, I was sitting in my office at the Environmental Enforcement Institute, reviewing organizational charts for the new Environmental Crimes Office. The office would have authority over environmental investigations across all federal agencies, with specialized prosecutors trained in environmental law and forensic accountants capable of tracking complex financial schemes involving environmental compliance fraud. But more importantly, the office would have resources to support environmental whistleblowers proactively rather than reactively. Environmental professionals who reported compliance violations would receive immediate federal protection, legal support, and career assistance to ensure that speaking up about environmental fraud enhanced rather than damaged their professional prospects. Jennifer Chen called me at 11:30, just as the Senate vote was being announced on C-SPAN. Congratulations, Madam Associate Deputy Attorney General. 87-13. Strongest Environmental Enforcement Confirmation Vote in Decades. The title felt surreal, like someone else's achievement that I was temporarily borrowing. 8 months earlier, I had been an unemployed single mother facing potential criminal charges for protecting environmental regulations. Now I was confirmed as one of the senior environmental enforcement officials in the federal government, with authority that extended across multiple agencies and policy development responsibility that would affect environmental protection for decades. That afternoon, I walked across the street to the Justice Department building for my swearing-in ceremony. Attorney General Martinez administered the oath in the main conference room, surrounded by environmental advocates, Justice Department officials, and congressional staff who had supported environmental enforcement reform since my original testimony. But the people who mattered most were sitting in the front row, Emma and Jake, dressed in formal clothes and beaming with pride that their mother was being sworn in as a senior federal official. Maria Gonzalez sat beside them, having taken the afternoon off from the Environmental Enforcement Institute to witness the culmination of the investigation that had started with my decision to expose environmental fraud at Meridian. After the ceremony, we walked outside into the late afternoon sunshine, and Emma asked the question that brought everything full circle. "Mom, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't testified to Congress about Meridian?" I thought about David Mitchell, now serving 12 years in federal prison for environmental fraud and conspiracy. I thought about Tyler Harrison, whose cooperation with federal investigators had resulted in a reduced sentence and witness protection. I thought about Rebecca Walsh, who had plea bargained to avoid RICO charges by providing testimony about environmental fraud across the energy consulting industry. But mostly I thought about the environmental professionals across the country who were now protected by the systems we had created, the federal projects that were now subject to real-time compliance monitoring, and the corporate executives who understood that environmental fraud would be detected and prosecuted systematically rather than ignored or covered up. Emma, I think about it every day. If I hadn't testified, dozens of companies would still be falsifying environmental data for federal projects. Hundreds of environmental professionals would still be afraid to speak up about compliance violations. And thousands of environmental crimes would go undetected and unprosecuted. Jake, practical in the way that 13-year-olds can be, asked the question that mattered most to him. "Are you happy with how everything turned out?" I looked at my children, healthy and confident and proud of their mother's work protecting environmental regulations. I thought about my new office in the Justice Department, where I would lead environmental enforcement policy for the entire federal government. I thought about the Environmental Crimes Office, which would ensure that environmental professionals across the country could speak up about compliance violations without risking their careers or family security. Yes, sweetheart, I'm happy with how everything turned out. That evening, we drove home to Arlington, past the Environmental Enforcement Institute where I had worked for the past 8 months, past the coffee shop, where Jennifer Chen and I had first discussed my evidence against Meridian, past the office building, where I had spent 12 years building expertise in environmental compliance that would eventually become the foundation for national environmental enforcement policy. As we pulled into our driveway, I reflected on the journey from that morning when I had first realized that Meridian was systematically falsifying environmental data, to this afternoon when I had been sworn in as Associate Deputy Attorney General for Environmental Crimes. The personal cost had been enormous, the professional risk had been absolute, but the outcome had exceeded anything I had dared to hope for when I first decided to contact congressional investigators. Environmental fraud was now being detected and prosecuted systematically across the federal government. Corporate executives faced real consequences for environmental crimes. Environmental professionals across the country knew that speaking up about compliance violations would be supported by federal law enforcement rather than punished by corporate retaliation. But most importantly, my children had witnessed the entire transformation, from the terrifying months when our family's security was threatened by corporate retaliation, to the vindication of seeing environmental enforcement become a national priority with institutional support and resources that would protect other families from facing the same impossible choices. The investigation that had started with my testimony about environmental fraud at Meridian Energy Solutions had become something much larger and more significant. a demonstration that individual courage, when combined with institutional support and systematic enforcement, could transform entire industries and protect environmental regulations for future generations. As I tucked Jake into bed that night, he asked me one final question that captured the essence of everything we'd experienced over the past 8 months. Mom, if another environmental person calls you because their company is doing bad things to the environment, what will you tell them? I'll tell them that the federal government is committed to protecting environmental regulations and the people who have the courage to defend them. I'll tell them that speaking up about environmental fraud will be supported rather than punished. And I'll tell them that their expertise and moral courage can create changes that protect environmental regulations for other people's children and grandchildren. The war between environmental protection and corporate profit would continue, but the balance of power had shifted fundamentally in favor of environmental enforcement and the professionals committed to protecting environmental regulations. Truth, when supported by documentation and federal enforcement, had proven more powerful than corporate intimidation and legal manipulation. And sometimes, when you're willing to sacrifice everything to protect environmental regulations, those regulations find ways to protect you in return, elevating your expertise and moral courage to positions where you can create systematic change that protects other people from facing the same impossible choices you confronted. The next morning, I would walk into my new office at the Justice Department as Associate Deputy Attorney General for Environmental Crimes, leading environmental enforcement policy for the entire federal government, and ensuring that environmental professionals across the country could speak up about compliance violations with the knowledge that their courage would be supported rather than punished. But that night, lying in bed in our house in Arlington, listening to the sounds of my children sleeping peacefully upstairs, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that individual courage, when combined with institutional support and systematic enforcement, can create lasting change that protects environmental regulations for future generations. 2 years after my confirmation as Associate Deputy Attorney General for Environmental Crimes, I stood at the podium of the National Environmental Law Conference in Denver, looking out at an audience of 500 environmental attorneys, policymakers, and corporate compliance officers who had gathered to hear about the transformation of federal environmental enforcement. The conference theme was Institutional Change Through Individual Courage, and my keynote address was titled, From Whistleblower to Policy Leader, Building Systems That Protect Environmental Defenders. The audience included faces I recognized from my years at Meridian Energy Solutions, environmental professionals who had watched my testimony to Congress and the subsequent investigation with a mixture of admiration and concern for their own career security. Many of them had contacted the Environmental Crimes Office over the past 2 years, reporting compliance violations at their companies with the confidence that federal law enforcement would protect rather than punish their professional integrity. But the most significant presence in the audience was Dr. Lisa Chen, Meridian's former Chief Environmental Officer, who had been hired away from the company 6 months before my testimony, and had spent the past 2 years rebuilding her career at a renewable energy startup that prioritized authentic environmental compliance. Lisa had reached out to me 3 months earlier, asking if she could share her perspective on corporate environmental culture at the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, I began. 2 years ago, I was an unemployed single mother facing potential criminal charges for exposing environmental fraud at my former employer. Today, I lead federal environmental enforcement policy for the entire United States government. This transformation wasn't the result of personal ambition or political connections. It was the consequence of documentation, persistence, and institutional support for environmental professionals who choose moral courage over career security. The applause was immediate and sustained, but I could see in the faces of the environmental professionals in the audience the same mixture of hope and caution that I had felt when I first contacted Jennifer Chen with my evidence against Meridian. They understood that speaking up about environmental violations could protect public health and safety, but they also understood that corporate retaliation remained a real threat despite federal protections. The Environmental Crimes Office has processed over 300 whistleblower reports in the past 2 years, I continued, resulting in 47 criminal prosecutions and over $2 billion in civil penalties against companies that attempted to defraud federal environmental programs. But more importantly, we've created systematic protection for environmental professionals who report compliance violations, ensuring that their expertise and moral courage enhance rather than threaten their career prospects. During the question and answer session that followed my presentation, a young environmental engineer from Phoenix raised her hand with a question that brought back memories of my own uncertainty when I first discovered the fraudulent reports at Meridian. Ms. Torres, I've documented what appears to be systematic falsification of groundwater contamination data at my company, but I'm the sole provider for my elderly parents and my younger brother who has special needs. How can I be sure that reporting these violations won't destroy my family's financial security? Her question captured the impossible choice that environmental professionals across the country faced when they discovered compliance violations, the same choice that had kept me silent for months, while I watched Meridian submit fraudulent environmental reports for federal projects. The fear wasn't just about personal career consequences. It was about the ripple effects on family members who depended on stable income and health insurance. The Environmental Crimes Office has created a comprehensive support system for environmental whistleblowers that includes immediate financial protection, career transition assistance, and long-term professional development opportunities, I replied. We've learned that protecting environmental regulations requires protecting the people who have the expertise and courage to defend them. After the session, the young engineer approached me with a folder containing what appeared to be months of documentation about groundwater contamination violations. Her name was Rebecca Martinez, and she had been collecting evidence of environmental fraud at her company for over a year while struggling with the same concerns about family security that had delayed my own decision to report Meridian's violations. Ms. Torres, I've read about everything that happened to you during the Meridian investigation, and I know that federal protections exist now that didn't exist then. But I'm still terrified of what might happen to my family if I report what I've discovered. I looked at the documentation she had prepared, recognizing the same meticulous attention to detail and moral commitment that had driven my own evidence collection against Meridian. Rebecca had photographed contaminated groundwater sites, documented falsified laboratory reports, and preserved email communications showing corporate executives instructing environmental staff to minimize contamination findings. Rebecca, what you've documented appears to represent systematic environmental fraud that could affect groundwater supplies for thousands of families. The Environmental Crimes Office exists specifically to support environmental professionals like you, who have the courage to protect public health despite personal risk. I gave her my direct contact information and connected her with the Environmental Crimes Office's Whistleblower Protection Coordinator, who would ensure that her family's financial security was protected, while federal investigators examined her evidence. 6 months later, Rebecca's company would face federal criminal charges for groundwater contamination fraud, and Rebecca would be hired as a senior environmental engineer with the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. But the most meaningful conversation of the conference happened that evening, when Lisa Chen and I met for dinner at a quiet restaurant near the convention center. Lisa had been one of Meridian's most respected environmental professionals, and her departure from the company months before my testimony had been attributed to, quote, pursuing new opportunities in renewable energy. Now, 2 years later, she was ready to discuss what had really driven her decision to leave Meridian. Sarah, I need you to know that I suspected what you eventually exposed for months before I left Meridian, she said, her voice careful but determined. I saw the same discrepancies in environmental reports, the same pressure from executives to minimize environmental findings, the same systematic manipulation of compliance data. Her admission didn't surprise me, but it confirmed something I had suspected during my years at Meridian. I wasn't the only environmental professional who had noticed the fraudulent reports. I was simply the one who had chosen to document and report them, despite the personal consequences. Why didn't you speak up? I asked, though I understood the answer from my own experience with the impossible choice between moral courage and family security. I was afraid, she replied simply. I had 2 young children, a mortgage, elderly parents who needed medical care. I convinced myself that leaving the company was enough, that I couldn't risk everything my family depended on to report violations that someone else might eventually discover. Lisa's honesty about her own moral struggle reminded me that environmental fraud persisted not because environmental professionals lacked integrity, but because corporate retaliation made speaking up about violations professionally and financially devastating. The systemic changes we had implemented through the Environmental Crimes Office were designed to eliminate that impossible choice by ensuring that environmental professionals could report violations without risking their family's security. Sarah, I want you to know that watching you testify to Congress and seeing the federal investigation that followed changed how I think about professional responsibility. I've spent the past 2 years building renewable energy projects with authentic environmental compliance, but I've also been documenting everything I learned about environmental fraud culture at Meridian. She handed me a flash drive containing what she described as comprehensive documentation of Meridian's environmental fraud culture, including internal communications, training materials, and policy documents that showed how environmental staff were systematically pressured to minimize environmental findings. Her evidence would eventually become crucial for understanding how environmental fraud operated across the energy consulting industry. Lisa, what you're providing will help federal prosecutors understand the institutional culture that enabled environmental fraud, and it will help us design better protections for environmental professionals who witness compliance violations. Our conversation continued past midnight, covering everything from the technical aspects of environmental fraud detection to the psychological impact of choosing moral courage over career security. Lisa's perspective as someone who had witnessed environmental fraud but initially chosen personal security over reporting violations provided crucial insights into the barriers that prevented environmental professionals from speaking up about compliance violations. The next morning, I flew back to Washington with Lisa's documentation and Rebecca Martinez's contact information, thinking about the transformation of environmental enforcement that had occurred since my testimony about Meridian's fraud. The Environmental Crimes Office had processed hundreds of whistleblower reports, resulting in dozens of criminal prosecutions and systematic changes in how corporations approached environmental compliance. But the most significant change was cultural rather than legal. Environmental professionals across the country now understood that reporting compliance violations would be supported rather than punished, that their expertise and moral courage would be valued rather than threatened, and that speaking up about environmental fraud could enhance rather than destroy their career prospects. When I arrived at my office in the Justice Department, my assistant handed me a stack of case files representing new environmental fraud investigations triggered by whistleblower reports from across the country. Each file represented someone who had made the same choice I had made 3 years earlier, choosing environmental protection over personal security, but with institutional support that hadn't existed when I first testified to Congress. The statistics were encouraging beyond anything I had dared to hope for when I first contacted Jennifer Chen with my evidence against Meridian. Environmental compliance fraud had decreased by 78% across federal projects. Voluntary reporting of environmental violations had increased by 400%, and environmental professional retention rates had increased significantly as corporate retaliation against environmental staff had become a federal crime. But the most meaningful measure of success was personal rather than statistical. Emma was now a freshman at Georgetown University, studying environmental law with plans to join the Justice Department's Environmental Crimes Office after graduation. Jake had continued his violin studies and was performing with the Washington Youth Symphony, but he had also developed an interest in environmental science inspired by watching his mother's work protecting environmental regulations. My mother Elena had moved from San Antonio to Arlington 6 months earlier, allowing her to spend more time with her grandchildren while providing the kind of emotional support that had sustained our family through the most difficult months of corporate retaliation and federal investigation. Her presence in our daily lives reminded me that the personal cost of speaking up about environmental fraud had been worth not just the professional vindication, but the moral example it provided for my children. The evening after my return from Denver, I sat in our kitchen in Arlington, reading through Rebecca Martinez's documentation, while Emma worked on a law school application essay titled Environmental Enforcement and Individual Courage: Lessons from the Meridian Investigation. Her essay analyzed the transformation of federal environmental policy that had resulted from my testimony, but it focused on the personal decision-making process that environmental professionals faced when they discovered compliance violations. "Mom, I've been thinking about the conference presentation you gave in Denver," Emma said, looking up from her laptop with the serious expression that indicated she had been processing complex ideas. "You talked about institutional change through individual courage, but what about all the environmental professionals who witnessed violations but didn't report them because they were afraid of retaliation?" Her question went to the heart of environmental enforcement policy, addressing the reality that environmental fraud persisted not because environmental professionals lacked integrity, but because corporate retaliation made speaking up professionally and financially devastating for people who couldn't afford to risk their family's security. Emma, that's exactly why the Environmental Crimes Office exists. We've learned that protecting environmental regulations requires protecting the people who have the expertise and courage to defend them. Creating institutional support for environmental whistleblowers eliminates the impossible choice between moral courage and family security. Jake joined our conversation from the living room, where he had been practicing a piece by Bach that required the kind of precision and patience that reminded me of environmental compliance work. Mom, do you think there are still companies doing what Meridian did, but nobody has reported them yet? His question was more perceptive than he probably realized, addressing the ongoing challenge of detecting environmental fraud in an industry where corporate pressure to minimize environmental findings remained strong despite increased federal enforcement. Jake, there are probably companies across the country that are still falsifying environmental data, but the difference now is that environmental professionals who discover those violations know they can report them safely. The Environmental Crimes Office receives new whistleblower reports every week from environmental professionals who have the courage to speak up about compliance violations. That night, as I reviewed case files from the Environmental Crimes Office while my children completed their homework around the kitchen table, I reflected on the journey from that morning when I had first discovered fraudulent environmental reports at Meridian to this evening when I was leading federal environmental enforcement policy for the entire country. The personal transformation had been extraordinary. From unemployed single mother facing corporate retaliation to senior federal law enforcement official with authority over environmental crimes prosecution. But the institutional transformation had been even more significant, creating systematic protection for environmental professionals who chose moral courage over career security, and ensuring that environmental fraud would be detected and prosecuted systematically rather than ignored or covered up. The investigation that had started with my testimony about environmental fraud at Meridian Energy Solutions had become something much larger and more lasting, a demonstration that individual courage, when combined with institutional support and systematic enforcement, could transform entire industries and protect environmental regulations for future generations. As I tucked my children into bed that night, Emma asked me one final question that captured the essence of everything we had experienced over the past 3 years. Mom, if you had to make the same choice again, knowing everything that would happen to our family, would you still testify to Congress about Meridian? I thought about the months of unemployment and corporate retaliation, the fear and uncertainty that had affected every aspect of our family life, the professional and personal risks that had seemed overwhelming when I first decided to expose environmental fraud. But I also thought about the hundreds of environmental professionals who were now protected by the systems we had created, the billions of dollars in environmental crimes that had been prevented, and the institutional changes that would protect environmental regulations for decades. Emma, I would make the same choice without hesitation. Because speaking up about environmental fraud wasn't just about protecting my own moral integrity. It was about protecting environmental regulations that exist to safeguard public health and safety for your generation and your children's generation. The next morning, I would walk into my office at the Justice Department as Associate Deputy Attorney General for Environmental Crimes, leading environmental enforcement policy for the entire federal government, and ensuring that environmental professionals across the country could speak up about compliance violations with the knowledge that their courage would be supported rather than punished. But that night, lying in bed in our house in Arlington, listening to the sounds of my children sleeping peacefully upstairs, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that individual courage, when combined with institutional support and systematic enforcement, can create lasting change that protects environmental regulations and the people who have the expertise and moral commitment to defend them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.